today's debate has been organised by USI, the IUA, the RIA, the THEA and the British Irish Chamber. In other words, people who have a big stake in our sector and what our sector can do for society, culture and the economy. We're hoping we'll provide the opportunity to hear from our panel, those who are charged with directing public policy for our state, on how they propose to deal with these challenges and the vision they would have for our sector in terms of teaching and research over the next half decade. We're delighted that over 400 people have decided to join us today. I'm delighted to see so many here in the theatre, and we have a large group online. And it's also great to welcome colleagues from across the higher education sector. Veronica Campbell here from the president of SETU, Colin Scott from UCD, and many others. Now, a few quick logistics before we start. We have closed captioning available today, and you can alter the size of those captions by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen for those watching in on Zoom. The debate is being recorded and will be available on iua.ie from tomorrow. And our hashtag, most importantly for social media, either the bane of our lives in university or a great tool for social advancement, is hashtag invest higher ed. But before we get going, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, the president of Dublin City University, Professor Dara Keogh, to say a few words. Dara.
Thank you very much, Gary. It's great to welcome everybody here today to the THEA Theatre. The theme of the game is precisely as Gary summed up at the end, hashtag invest. As Gary said too, it's appropriate that we're here in the THEA Theatre, theatre named after a poet and a teacher first and foremost. And the purpose of today's event in advance, I suppose, of a general election, if we can paraphrase Heaney, is to hope for a great sea change and to look forward to a stage in Irish higher education where history and hope may rhyme. Delighted to see so many friends in the room and online who are joining us for this timely and important discussion. Gary has called out at the outset, and I just reiterate our gratitude to our partners who have joined with us for this event. So I see colleagues from the Royal Irish Academy, from the British Irish Chamber, from THEA, and of course a key stakeholder in all of this from USI, the Union of Students in Ireland. The students are our purpose. In terms of Irish kind of political debate and discourse, it's unusual to have all of the social partners united on a single issue. And if we take this issue, for instance, we can see IBEC, the Chambers of Commerce, Congress of Trade Union, the Union of Students in Ireland, the IUA, THEA, all steadfast in calling for what they describe as the criminal neglect of higher education in Ireland. That is significant in itself. And the unity amongst the key stakeholders reflects, I think, and captures a priority for us all. And the great kind of statement and value of this university, that nothing is more important to the welfare of a nation than the education of its people. And that is critical. And the current government itself emphasises that priority and imperative. And their flagship policy is not called funding institutions, but it's aptly called funding the future. And that's what's at stake here. We are talking about the future we want for Ireland, for our young people, and how we see ourselves in the decades ahead, as Gary said at the beginning. The problem, of course, is that there's a very wide gap between the government rhetoric and the reality of their contribution to actually delivering that. And in very crude terms, the Taoiseach, when Minister for Higher Education himself, identified that gap as €307 million per annum, not 307 million in total, 307 million per annum. Nothing is more important to the welfare of a nation than the education of its people. And universities have been the lifeblood of Ireland's social and economic advance in the last 50 years. And it's the quality of our research, the exceptional quality of our graduates that are the bedrock of Ireland's economic success. That miracle in education, take it back to the quality of primary education, free secondary education, and then universal third-level education, has turned what was one of the most deprived countries in Europe into the poster child for innovation and investment. Ireland is a magnet, or has been a magnet, for FDI into high-growth areas such as medtech, ICT, agri-foods, biopharma and renewable energy. If we look at the news in the last 2 weeks, the Apple decision is significant for Ireland, and I think it represents a double-edged sword for us. On the one hand, it represents a windfall, and that can be discussed how that might be employed. But on the other side, on the sharper side, I think it is a serious warning sign for our future. Now, the government fought that case. Rightly or wrongly, they made the decision that they would fight that case. And they did so and stressed again and again throughout that Ireland's success in attracting FDI, which is critical to us, was not based on our taxation regime alone, but it was based too on our time zone, our geographic position, but more than that, it was based on the exceptional quality and the depth of our talent pipeline, the quality and depth of our talent pipeline. And folks, today as we gather in the THEA Theatre, we face the reality that that pipeline is in serious jeopardy. And it's in jeopardy really as a consequence of the state's own neglect. And we need to call that as it is, that Ireland's talent proposition has been seriously eroded by the failure of the state to invest in its future and the gap between the platitudes and the realities. Ireland is steadily losing our edge in what is a highly competitive landscape, a landscape where our European neighbours have ramped up investment in their people. People, of course, being the ultimate renewable resource. And they have ramped it up precisely as we turn off the tap. And the consequence of that underinvestment is all too apparent for all of us to see. The Irish university class sizes are now significantly higher than they were in the late 1970s, which was perhaps our bleakest decade. At that stage, the student-staff ratio in UCD was 13:1. Now it's over 20:1. The accommodation shortage has eroded the quality of student life and the rounded education experience. It's a barrier to access to the best education. Ireland's spending on research is just 2% of GDP, 2%, and that's less than a third of the European average. And more than half of the research equipment, the IUA will tell us, is over a decade old. It's older than the original iPhone. And I would wager that the rest of it is older than Enda Kenny's Nokia. And meanwhile, the National Training Fund has been bloated to almost 2 billion. And significantly too that fund is created specifically from taxes collected with the express purpose of supporting talent development in Ireland. As a people, we're engaged with politics and we look on. We look on at what's happening in the United States. We look towards November with incredulity. In the past, we looked across the Irish Sea to Britain and we looked at Brexit. And we looked as that car crash evolved and that exercise in self-harm that the British people inflicted upon themselves. Without being melodramatic, can I say explicitly here that a failure to invest in higher education in Ireland will be our Brexit. It will be as significant as Brexit to Ireland and to the citizens of this republic. So, as we face a general election, today is an opportunity for us and a panel of our would-be legislators representing most parties, our would-be legislators, as they kind of look forward. And I suppose Gary's questions today will be, how will they, in government, rescue Ireland from the oven-ready disaster that will be the consequences of underinvestment in our people's future. Thank you, and thank you, Gary.
Thanks very much, Dara. for those very inspiring and pertinent words as we face into the crisis that faces higher education over the next half decade or so. And now I'd like to introduce our panel. To my left here is Mary Farrell, Galway TD for Sinn Féin and spokesperson for the party on higher education. We have Richard Barrett, TD for Down for People Before Profit, and that party spokesperson on higher education. We have Annie Hoey, Senator for the Labour Party and spokesperson on higher education. And then from the government side, we have Malcolm Byrne, Fianna Fáil Senator and spokesperson on higher education, and Senator Joe O'Reilly for Fine Gael. We have about 75 minutes. I'm going to ask a few questions at the beginning, but then I will also open it up to the floor, because we're very keen to see what our stakeholders here today have to say. Malcolm Byrne, I'm going to start with you. Are you happy that Fianna Fáil, the party of free secondary education, the party of PRTLI, which transformed research in the 1990s, is in government and overseeing a process of what the province of Trinity College calls a slow and gentle decline in higher education?
Well, thank you very much for that easy question to start, Gary, and just to thank the organisers for inviting me and for organising this very important event, and to say that I agree with a lot of the concerns that are being expressed. I think to set in context, and you asked the question around, how are we preparing for the next 50 years, which is what further and higher education has to be about. And the reason why Fianna Fáil also established, and Gary, you forgot, established the Department of Further Higher Education, Research and Innovation and Science was not simply that it would become an administrative department, but that it would become a department that would be preparing for future national and global challenges. I can certainly say that I think the fact that Funding Our Future was set out, and I think this is what's critical. Funding Our Future is not an IUA document or USI document or anything else. It's a government document that builds on a series of reports that people know about, which sets out very clearly that 307 million in core funding needs to be provided. And I don't think, and while the government has provided additional funds for core funding, and while there has been funding provided for additional higher education places and the expansion of the system, unless we address the core funding issue, then certainly the crisis is going to continue. So I'm not going to disagree with you on some of those issues.
And will your party give a commitment to covering that gap, and in what time frame?
So what I will say, and I don't want to preempt what our manifesto is going to say, but I can certainly say in the discussions that are happening on the manifesto, that 307 million, and by the way, that was obviously 2 years ago and will have to be adjusted for inflation, that cost needs to be addressed. I raised it in the Shannon, and I know within our parliamentary party, there was a lot of annoyance over the last two budgets that in the first budget that we only saw, 40 million given for core funding. And even though, it was 100 million plus in the last budget, a lot of that has obviously been eaten up in terms of the pay awards. We've got to divorce the pay awards, which, universities and other higher education institutions are tied to. We've got to divorce that, if you like, from the core funding requirements. I don't want to preempt the manifesto commitment, but what I will say is there will be a very clear commitment about meeting the full economic costs within that manifesto around retaining the department in a particular form. And I think the other thing, Gary, which is crucial, we want to be in government to be able to deliver it. Because whatever decision has to be about the parties being in government who are able to deliver on those issues.
Thanks. Richard Boyd Barrett, does your party want to be in government? You're always listening to people like me complaining that people before profit don't want to be in government and are happy complaining but have all these solutions. What's your vision for higher education, and do you want to be in government to see it through?
I want to be in government to change things, but I don't want to be in government for the sake of being in government. So, and I think that mistake has been made by parties in the past who drop certain key principles or pledges in order simply to be in government for its own sake. And I think that's the road to disaster, and has been for those who've pursued that approach to politics. So first and foremost, I'm an activist who's interested in changing the world, who happened to get elected. So
A few times.
a few times, yeah. But I think it's movements of people, whether it's students or workers, that change the world. And I'm most interested in using the platform I have for promoting movements for change in our society. So that's my particular approach to the political question. But on a vision for higher education, first of all, I think something that I really think needs to be a kind of dramatic shift in perspective, certainly in the political world, is to break from this notion that access to higher education should be rationed. And I can't understand it. To me, it is incomprehensible that we are still rationing access to higher and further education. To me, that's a legacy of a sort of 19th century thinking. Once upon a time, there were obstacles put in the way of working class people accessing secondary education or education at all. Most of us now would think that that's outrageous, that there should be obstacles put in the way of those things, but we still seem to think it's acceptable to have financial and other obstacles put in the way of people gaining access to the highest level of education to realize their personal potential. It's incomprehensible and it's irrational from a societal point of view, and that, I think, is now becoming fairly obvious, if it wasn't obvious before, because probably the biggest problem the country is facing at the moment is critical skills shortages in multiple areas, which are now inhibiting the ability of our society as a whole to advance. So why we would put any fees, any financial or other financial obstacles in the way of people accessing. So I'm for open access, completely open access to higher and further education based on what people want to do. And I'm also for the people who deliver that higher and further education, not as about half, if not more than half of them have to do, live a completely precarious existence. I think it's outrageous, quite frankly, that people are doing their postgrads or their doctorates and teaching and are, on basically hour-to-hour contracts or completely precarious existence. So that has to dramatically change. And the last point I would make is that I'm an art student. I
Like myself.
Graduated in literature, and I find it absolutely extraordinary that we invest, as a country that's so associated with artistic endeavour, that we invest about a third of what is the average investment in the area of arts and culture compared to the EU average. Right? I just find that absolutely mind-boggling, and that most of our artists live in poverty. And similarly, although I was never as familiar with science, but my friend Conor Reddy, who's involved in the Postgrad Workers' Organisation, has educated me about the similar situation in the area of research and innovation, that all these scientists, people trying to develop in that area, are living in poverty, and that we spend far less in that area than our European counterparts. So to me, this is just mind-boggling. We have to invest in it, and we need a higher education system that is based on the advance of our society and realizing the potential of every single human being, and not one that is essentially dictated by the interests of a small number of multinational corporations.
I might come back to you in a minute about how you propose to pay for it. We're also joined by Senator Pauline O'Reilly, the Green Party spokesperson on higher education. You're welcome, Pauline. But I'll go to you, Joe O'Reilly, again, and to ask the question I asked Malcolm Byrne. Are you happy? Fine Gael have been in power for 13 years now. 14 if the election will go into February of next year. Are you happy with the way higher education has sort of dwindled along over the course of the past decade under your watch?
Thank you, and again, thank you for the invitation, etc. You didn't invite me here today to list what we have invested, and we have had considerable investment, and we've effected considerable changes in the welfare of students, etc. I can go through that later, but let's address the question you asked on funding. I accept the need for the 307 million annual figure, and I accept that that should be outside of pensions and outside of pensions, outside of salary commitments, that should be an investment in the colleges. I accept that. I further accept that the 1.5 billion that's sitting of employers' money, that's sitting in the National Training Fund, the NTF, that too should be loosened. And there are public spending constraints there, but the Taoiseach is committed on record and within our parliamentary party to loosening that fund, to untapping that, or for want of a better term, so that we get that money invested and we address the other funding question. But I think funding third level at all is a multifaceted question. You have the funding that I've discussed a moment ago that is required, and I fully accept that, and I fully believe we should address that in this budget, and I accept publicly that if we don't, it will be a failure. There's no point in defying logic or defying truth. We're not here for that. But it's a multifaceted issue. There is the welfare. I mean, third level should be accessible to every individual, provide the best possible experience, and give expression to their uniqueness. And every student needs a good experience of third level. So the first element is to look after student welfare. It's also, I know, could be put down to populism in the sense that politicians will go for that option because that gets votes. But it is the students at the central issue. So you have to address student costs. It's good now that we're back funding postgraduate by way of the SUSI grants. But you have to address student costs. And I think, and I'm constantly saying this at our parliamentary party meeting, I have no problem saying it publicly, that one of our failures to date, but we're working on it, and we had a significant investment this year, 100 million, but it's not enough. We need on-campus student accommodation. I was chatting to Veronica, the president of the Southeast University, outside informally, and I was saying to her, she's a product of Trinity, or rather had taught in Trinity, and she won't mind me saying this publicly. I was saying to Veronica that Trinity has the great advantage that students live on campus, that they have the integrated university experience. Now, I think it's a crying shame that we haven't achieved more on student accommodation. Student accommodation, I think, is critical. On-campus student accommodation, more of it, and cheaper student accommodation. I also think the level of grants, the level of support, the elimination of fees, the student welfare is critical. And then, of course, you must fund the university. And I'll just say finally, we are in a great place as a country economically. And that place has been arrived at by the strength of the third level sector that made us attractive to inward investment, that created a lot of indigenous business, and investment in third level in the past, and indeed in all levels of education. And as a former primary teacher, I would argue it should come upward. But investment in education has paid off. We are now in the happy position that we have the money, even outside of the Apple money, we have the money to invest now in third level. And I think it's incumbent upon us to do it. And I have no problem coming here and saying the investment is currently inadequate. We need to reach the figures that we have accepted as a government of the 307 million per annum. We need to do that. We need to unloosen or unlock the National Training Fund, and we need to improve conditions for our students, and we need student accommodation. It's a holistic package.
Okay.
No one element can stand alone.
Right, okay. Mairead Farrell, I presume you want to be in government, and I presume you might want to be Minister for Higher Education. What would you do in your first 100 days to address some of these issues that Professor Keogh, the president of DCU, made in his opening remarks about deficits and
Is this, yeah, this
is,
is working
you're
now, okay.
good to go.
So I suppose, first of all, Magi as an gur agus tamafir wichji agus gomsa and shaw and we my fragger keshni a chumala shin boalum kleshta weebshe cared na jokrach the atagi is marshinja. I just want to say thanks, first of all, for the invite because it's my first time opportunity to speak. And I want to say that for me, this is obviously, I'm here to answer questions, right? But if there is something that I say that you disagree with, or if there's something that you think I don't understand fully or anything like that, I really appreciate it being said in the later part of the Q&A because we are here to learn as well. At the end of the day, you are the experts. So for me, there's a few things, right? You know, we talk about the funding gap and we talk about the 307 million that was identified by the government in 2022. We also hear, you know, the talk about the nearly the 2 billion by January in the National Training Fund and the money that is there. I drafted a piece of legislation that would allow access to the National Training Fund because I don't see the point in having the National Training Fund sitting there, you know, increasing in the amount of money while at the same time we have the core funding gap. We have a situation which really surprised me when I first took over this spokespersonship about a year and a half ago. What I did, and I really thank all the universities for letting me in their doors, but a lot of the universities I visited them and I visited different people who particularly worked in the area of research. And what shocked me was the really creaking infrastructure, not in terms of just the broad infrastructure that we have in terms of campuses, but also the actual research or infrastructure that's used for research. And the fact that there just simply isn't a type of funding model for that infrastructure as well, which I think is really important. Even if it's not a situation whereby you can say, okay, in a 5-year government term, you're going to, you know, deal with all the infrastructure issues in terms of research. But what you can do is have some kind of multi-annual funding so that people know, you know, that there is an opportunity to apply for funding or that there will be an opportunity to get funding at some particular point. And what really concerns me and what was raised with me a number of times by that kind of research element was that as a result of that, we see so many of our researchers go abroad. They then obviously, you know, and look, it's good for people to go abroad to learn, obviously in different universities and all that kind of thing, but they then have access to different types of research infrastructure which they simply don't have here, and it's concerning then if they're actually going to come back and bring that talent and that information back. So I drafted that amendment for the access to the NTF. Now, unfortunately, it was ruled out of order because it said that only the minister can actually change that. So although I have that piece of legislation ready to go, it can't be debated, which I think is a pity, because I think even if we could just debate that issue, it would be really helpful. But second of all, it can't actually be amended unless it's the minister. So am I saying that we would do that in government?
Yes.
Yeah, 100% I am saying that. I have the amendment, I have the legislation ready to go, but also if I were the minister, I would actually be able to do it.
Okay, great.
So that's, I suppose, the first thing. The second thing that we talk about is obviously the pay awards. Before the recess in the summer there, I must have been June, I can't remember exactly when, but I have the opportunity to raise oral questions with the Minister for Further and Higher Education on a kind of 5-6 week basis here and there. And one of the things that I did literally ask was this whole issue of the pay awards, and was he going to put in a supplementary budget to allow, you know, to allow that funding. Now, he kind of came back non-committal, didn't really say exactly what he was going to do. Obviously, I do hope that that happens, but what I do think is really important is that it has been highlighted really well this summer, I felt, by the university sector, so that it's not like just seen as a kind of a niche issue that people aren't, you know, aware of, but that it was given that kind of voice in terms of media coverage and that kind of thing. Then thirdly, just in relation to the whole issue of student accommodation, just on the whole issue of student accommodation, right? Like I have, obviously I'm from Galway, right? So obviously University of Galway is I went there, it's the place I know best, you know, it just simply is. I know a lot of students that go there, so I've seen their accommodation and that. And we do have very, very high-end student accommodation at this moment in time. Now, I've had the discussions, and a lot of the students' unions will say, from what they've told me, is that they don't need that kind of high-end student accommodation. Then the universities will say, well, that's what the students tell us they want, right? Either which way, the reality here is that it is very, very costly, and it just makes it, more, out of the reach of students. I was in one of the new student accommodation places in Galway, and when I say that, like, you wouldn't see that in Canary Wharf, you wouldn't see that level of accommodation, in my view, as somebody who used to do a bit of work there. You just would not see that. So I just found it quite astonishing. But what we do need to see is a few things in terms of student accommodation. Number one, in the budget last year, we did not see any additional funding in student accommodation. We had pledged 100 million in terms of student accommodation. We need to work out exactly what affordable accommodation is and what it looks like. One of the things I haven't seen is exactly how we kind of get to that, but we need to make sure that we get to that it's affordable. We need to look at the shovel-ready projects that we have and actually deliver on them, rather than having a situation where we see the re-announcement of student accommodation that has previously been announced. In terms of the technological universities, we have to allow them to borrow for student accommodation. This is something that I feel now, I'm open to, if people from the technological universities feel different, correct me or say to me that you disagree, but that would be my view. It was my understanding that that was what government was going towards. But when I questioned the now Taoiseach in relation to it when he was the minister, it didn't seem to me that it was going that way, but that it was going towards public-private partnerships. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but those, I suppose, are the three issues.
Okay, that's very useful. Anyhow, if you were Minister for Higher Education, what would be first on your agenda? Is that a promise of Labour and Sinn Féin going into government at the next election?
I mean, I don't think you're going to find anyone across this panel with wildly differing opinions as to what needs to happen in the sector. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's this concept of us all kind of coming with vastly differing philosophical approaches. I from my understanding of people across here, perhaps we might all end up disagreeing at some point. I would like to see the technology universities having that borrowing framework lifted, not just for student accommodation, but obviously for capital investment and other areas. I think a primary thing that I would like to see, we're talking a lot about, obviously we're in a higher education debate, but the whole point of having a standalone department and a standalone minister is that concept of kind of post-secondary education at every level and at every different way, so further education, apprenticeships, technological universities, we still have some IoTs, that kind of landscape and adult lifelong learning. I don't think that landscape is in any meaningful way currently woven together. It seems still a little bit haphazard. I was only meeting with people from further education yesterday, and we had a huge conversation about how the apprenticeship model has now created this two-tier apprenticeship model, and it's become very gendered, where the old craft apprenticeships are paid one way, the newer apprenticeships under the new scheme are done another way. This idea of creating a holistic landscape under a single ministry, if we don't get that right, then we're just going to continue having these kind of haphazard pieces where everyone is trying to grab at each other, and no matter which group or sector that I meet with, they always say, God, you see over there, the universities are getting all the money. And then I meet someone from the university sector and they're like, the technology universities are getting all of the money. And everyone, this concept of us all fighting against each other, when really we should have a post-second level or cradle to whatever landscape. So I think if a minister who has been given, and I appreciate the ministry is new, it's only 4 years in, but if we can't get to grips with having a meaningful, cohesive, holistic education sector underneath that remit, then you have to question what is the purpose of that, because otherwise we just continue having these pieces and everyone's fighting with everyone trying to get pieces of a pie, when actually we should all really, those sectors should all be able to work together, harmonizing together, where people should be able to move from one to the other, people should be able to come from further education into university education up to PhD if they want to, they should be able to exit out of further education and be perfectly happy that that's what they've done. So I'm not sure if that can be achieved in the first 100 days of being a minister, but if underneath that minister we can't get a cohesive sector, then you have to question what the point of that is. That would be something I would like to see as a priority, is actually creating a cohesive sector where people can learn. I have to think of a better phrase than cradle to grave, because it's a little bit gloomy at the end of it. And I don't know how many people at Cradle are learning, although there was someone in music generation through FE, and they were 3 months old, so they were doing great. But this, this concept of people being able to exit in and out of the sector at any point, and that was to me what I really thought having that minister, that standalone ministry for that was for, was to create a cohesive sector. So we can do all of the things, and I think then from that flows your funding into accommodation, your funding into research. I think when you have that cohesive sector, you have a research database where we know what all the different pieces of equipment across all of the different institutions are. So students can, if their institution doesn't have that equipment, they know they can go to another institution. I know that's something that the IOA were talking about in terms of we don't even have a database as to what research infrastructure we have across Ireland, who has what, how old it is, and who can go and get it from anywhere. But unless we have a cohesive vision for the sector, all of the other bits, the accommodation, the SUSI, the who gets what grants, I think that's all going to keep filtering around and messing around the place. Of course, we have SUSI for technology universities, but we don't have those same supports for further education, for PLCs. You know, so this concept of who even gets support and extra funding to go on for education, we don't have that vision, I think, yet. So that would be something I'd like to see. It's a bit more of a tightened up vision as to what the sector should look like, and I think a lot more things might flow from that then.
Okay, thanks very much. Pauline O'Reilly, I suppose my question to Mairead and to Annie, it was based around what you might call the sort of dichotomy between technocracy and vision. So we kind of have a technocratic view of the state. I've been going on about this for years. The minister goes in, they talk to their civil servants, yeah, we'll try and close the gap from 307 to 207 or whatever. But where is the big vision? Where is the big vision in higher education? And what is the green vision for higher education?
Yeah, look, and apologies that I was late,
You're
Gary.
okay.
So, look, I'm actually the spokesperson from cradle to grave, if we want to use Annie's terminology there. So I've been chair of a national school and founding a Steiner National School based on nature-based, I suppose, approach to education. I've been the chair of Home Education Network Ireland, and I've home educated my own kids up to a certain point. And I've also been on the Údarás of University of Galway as a city councillor. So I've kind of seen the whole gamut, and I've guest lectured in pedagogy actually at the University of Galway. And I do think sometimes we do get, now bogged down is the wrong word, but we do talk about the money instead of the vision. The money, because it is so important, because we're seeing a reduction in research year on year because of the lack of funding. But we do have to have that overall vision. And I believe, and this is the approach of the Greens, and I'm actually chair of the Greens as well, the chair of the Greens as well, and chair of the Manifesto Working Group. So I'm here to learn, just as Mairead said as well. So I'd love to get people's input into the manifesto. We're in the middle of a revolution at the moment. So we've had the Industrial Revolution, we're kind of part way through a digital revolution, but we're also in the middle of a green revolution. And I worry that Ireland is falling behind in that. We're falling behind because we're failing to put the money in, but we're falling behind as well because it's kind of catch up in terms of the employment that's needed to sustain the kind of green growth. If you look at the west coast of Ireland, which is where myself and Mairead are from the same constituency in Galway, we have a capacity of 80 gigawatts of wind off the west coast. And we do have this opportunity at the moment to be world leaders and to actually be mass exporters of energy. We also still retain, I suppose, a tourism that's based on nature. And we don't have the capacity in third level to really capture that. We don't really have the capacity yet in terms of industry either, but we're getting there. But I do worry when you look at the increase, I guess, in the NTF. We're looking at that increase, and we're failing to extract the money that's required for research. But if I was to say what the number one thing that comes up on the doors, and I don't want to tell anybody when the election's going to be, but I'm canvassing like crazy. No, I don't, but we can all guess. So I'm canvassing like crazy, and like funding for universities does not come up on the doors. It doesn't. And to go back to the point that's been made here earlier about the politics of this, what comes up on the doors is accommodation for students and transport for students. And and infrastructure in order to, I suppose, entice people into education and into research and continuing education beyond now. Pretty much everybody thinks, you know, I'll do my BA or I'll do my undergrad. But I said to, you know, one of our members recently, oh, so this is your final year? And she said, oh, well, not really. Obviously, I've got my MA and my PhD after that. You know, it's just this kind of expectation, I think, that people have that they will continue. But they're failing, I suppose, to feel supported in that choice. So that is the number one thing that comes up. And I would absolutely agree with Mairead in the sense about the education in Galway. I was there for the launch of, the accommodation in Galway. I was there for the launch of this new tranche of accommodation in University of Galway. And to say it's over spec, I mean, is an understatement. And the Students' Union were there at the time and invited to speak. And that was their overriding contribution was, well, this is what we were told it would be at the start. And now we're given something that is actually well beyond what we wanted in terms of luxury, but also well beyond what we want in terms of affordability. But I'm also seeing councillors and politicians from many, many parties who are also objecting to student accommodation that is off campus in areas around the country. So we I think it's really important to have on-campus accommodation. It's really important to have it, you know, to leverage, I guess, finance for universities and for technological universities to be able to facilitate that. But we also need just accommodation, just generally, and it needs to be, you know, for single people and not just families. And the biggest objections that I see are objections to things that are apartments or for young people or for people living on their own. So, you know, I think we all have to call people out for that as well.
Okay, Maria, do you want to come back in? And I have a question then for Richard.
Yeah, I actually just have a question. This is something that's kind of been on my
You're
mind.
answering the questions.
Yeah, well, it's in relation to this really high-end accommodation, right? Because I think we can all kind of agree it's extremely high-end. You know, Pauline was saying the same thing. And what constantly kind of in the back of my mind, and I could be totally wrong on this, I'm sure I'll be told if I am, but obviously we use that accommodation in the summer months then, say the Galway races or whatever it may be, and that brings in a certain element of money. And what's always in the back of my mind is that because there is the funding gap, right, that universities need to try and like close themselves, is there an element whereby there's this kind of particularly high-end accommodation in order to try and fund that over the summer months, and then with the hope of the impact that it would then make it cheaper for the students over the college term. But that's just, it's always been in the back of my mind, and it's something that I've never been able to really get the answer to. But I always wonder, is that kind of the element and why we have this high-end accommodation?
Right, we might
I could be hated by the audience after that, but it's just
No,
something that's in my mind.
We'll come back to that in a minute. Richard, so student contribution. So if and for all our panel here, if you promise to reduce or abolish the student contribution, I mean, the latest figure I have is something along each €1,000 reduction would cost about 100 million a year. How do you get around that? How do you pay for it?
Yeah, it costs 100 million. And
I'm going to ask that to all the panel, and then I'm going to open it up
Yeah.
to the audience. So, Richard, yeah, you go first.
Yeah, it would cost about 100 million, and indeed we want to get rid of all other fees as well, of every description: repeat fees, mature students, postgrad fees, as well as have put more money into subsidised student accommodation. And I do want to say a word just about borrowing, by the way. I mean, I'm okay with giving third-level institutions the right to borrow as long as the accommodation is not dictated by the costs of finance and the profit motive of the financiers. And I'd be deeply worried if the provision of affordable student accommodation was dependent on cost recovery or profit recovery for financial institutions. To my mind, the state has to recognise we need subsidised student accommodation, that is actually affordable. And all of that costs money. So it's more than a fair question. One thing I have highlighted again and again and again, and I will do it again here today, is that the research and development tax credit is now running at about 800 million euro a year. That's a tax relief. I'm also on the finance committee where we examine these things for those financial nerds or economic nerds that are here. And tax expenditures are a shadow budget, in my opinion. A shadow budget. It's the budget that's never discussed. But there are enormous giveaways to certain vested interests. And one of the biggest of those tax expenditures is the research and development tax credit. And that goes overwhelmingly to 20 or 30 companies. Overwhelmingly. I mean, tiny amounts go to actual small, if any, really. But it's overwhelmingly going to already staggeringly profitable, enormously wealthy multinational corporations. 800 million and rising every single year. Now, I ask myself a simple question. Do I want to give 800 million of public money to Apple, Google and Facebook, or do I want to give it to third level education? And to me, once you ask the question, the answer is obvious. So even looking at that and redistributing that public expenditure in favor of addressing all the issues and financing all the issues of free access to third level education, dealing with precarious pay and poor pay, student accommodation, you name it. To me, it's obvious the benefit to our society and indeed the redirection of our society in a way that would be beneficial from the point of view of culture, innovation, science, addressing the environmental questions. To me, it's just obvious that it would be a better expenditure of that money.
Okay.
So that is just one measure we could take to find more than finance the issues that we're discussing here today.
Malcolm Byrne, what's the Fianna Fáil view on the student contribution, and if you're going to abolish it or reduce it, how would you pay for it?
So I'll be blunt. Politics is about choices. If the government has to make a choice, if we want to increase access, and for me the priority is about access, what we do then is we significantly increase the amounts under the SUSI grant scheme, and then we also increase the thresholds. Reducing the student contribution, and I know it's a very attractive soundbite, and in an ideal world, it's something that we would do, but reducing the student contribution will not benefit the most disadvantaged students. And in terms of government priority, it has to be around access. From the 1990s, what people will remember, when free fees were abolished, free fees did nothing to improve access to higher education. But what it did do was it meant that universities and higher education institutions were far more dependent on the state for their sources of funding, rightly or wrong, whether you agree with that. And the problem was that the state did not make up the shortfall that happened as a result of the introduction of free fees. So what I will say to you very straight in terms of the priorities for the budget, and I accept, and I might come back to the vision thing because the debate is on higher education funding rather than the broader debate on higher ed, but it is related. But in terms of the priorities and for Fianna Fáil and what we're talking about, one, it's addressing the core funding, funding our future, the Cassell's report, that is absolutely critical. The second issue is around research infrastructure and the points that have been made, that Dara made earlier, particularly around basic research infrastructure, the fact that over half is over 10 years old, that a third is over 15 years old, that is completely unfair. And in terms of for emerging and starting researchers, the basic stipend paid to them. But the third area that if we are going to address on the funding question, on the access issue, rather than the populist cut to fees, the money needs to be invested in SUSI grants and in access and supports. What I want to come to, because I do want to touch on, and it relates to what is the purpose of universities and so on, and it also ties in with Richard's point around state economic policy. So Dara, the historian, set out some of the history. but if I sum up state economic policy in Ireland, up until the 1960s, it was very inward-looking and so on. We then made, what I view as two crucial decisions. Free second-level education, and we started to expand, particularly with the
Yeah, no, we know
RTCs.
that.
But
where are we?
But this is where we're going. So we made that decision, and then what we relied on basically for the second 50 years of the state was tax and talent. They were the two incentives. And by the way, I am supportive of the policies that attracted all of those multinationals that are employing many of our graduates, that Richard does go to funds the NTF and others, because the economy needs to be in a good state to fund anything. Our challenge for the next 50 years, and this is what we need to look at doing, is the students who are coming into our universities now, who just completed their Leaving Cert, I won't talk about the mature students just yet, they're going to be working on current form until the 2070s, and based on current life expectancy, they're going to be living until the 2090s. In fact, 1 in 5 of them are going to live to see the 22nd century. And our challenge is, how do we have a higher and further education system that will allow for the lifelong opportunities, that Pauline was talking about. And there are 3 big challenges that we need to ensure, and this is why the department was created in the first place. But there are 3 big challenges I think we need to address. Yes, there is the sustainability challenge, the climate and biodiversity challenge. We've got to be able to adapt to that. The technological revolution, which is going to require each and every one of us to upskill and to readapt, particularly because of the impact of AI and other technologies. But there's also the demographic challenge, which we haven't been talking about. The fact that we are all living older and longer, and that has economic impacts as well. And all of those feed in to the funding debate. So it does feed back into Annie's point around a coherence within the department. But politics is about making choices, and you asked, and that's why I'm saying core funding, research infrastructure, and Susie grants.
Okay, and you'll forgive me if for opening up the beyond sort of funding, because if we don't have vision, funding is technocratic and pointless. Mairead, what's the Sinn Féin view on the student contribution, and if you're abolishing it, how would you pay for it?
Yeah, so first of all, I actually welcome the fact that Malcolm I think it's really important that we're really honest in this debate, and in the run-up to the budget and the manifesto. We have always been very clear that we would abolish it. It's part of our alternative budget, and that's going to be launched in the coming days. So that's all sets out exactly how we finance and what we spend. So to me, it is a question of access. We have we've had free secondary school education for a long period of time. We know how beneficial that is. And I remember when these fees started kind of going up and coming in, I did my Leaving Cert in 2008, which was a bit of a bleak time to do your Leaving Cert, and then you go into college, and we had the big student movement at the time against the increase in fees. We had the likes of free education for everyone and other student movements as well, and we had the big protests. We're totally committed to abolishing the student contribution charge, but obviously that it will be funded, and that it isn't a situation like the pay awards where we get rid of it and we don't give any the correct funding for yourselves. But the only thing I would say is,
abolishing the student charge will not benefit a single
I
disadvantaged student.
think you had a good
look,
speak to them,
to be
Malcolm.
fair,
Right.
Malcolm, I'm not going to be lectured about the situation for students by somebody who's been in government for the last number of years, and we've seen how difficult it is for our students, specifically in relation to access to university, because they simply cannot afford student accommodation. They cannot get student accommodation, let alone afford it. So I'll leave lectures to another day. But so I suppose that's kind of where we would be coming from. There was something else I was going to say, but now it's obviously gone completely out of my mind because
That's
I was
okay.
interrupted.
Thanks. Annie Hoey, Labour was the party of free fees in universities. Are you going to give out to Malcolm Byrne for his attack on it? And what is your party's view on the student contribution, and how would you pay for it?
I do think, the children who are now attending post-second level education are the children of that generation who were able to go to universities and other places in the 90s. I don't think it went far enough. And we know when we have postcodes side by side, when there's drastic differences in who goes on to education from postcode to postcode, depending where they're from, what their parents study, it hasn't gone far enough. I don't think there's any question about that. But there is a whole cohort of people in the 90s who simply did not have the opportunity to attend university when the fees were exorbitantly high, who did get to go, and we're now seeing their own children getting to go we have a very high attrition rate in Ireland of people who, but again, it's all divided by postcode. It's like when we say we have full employment, when we don't actually have full employment for people, disabled people, migrant people, we can't say we have full access to further and higher education when we simply don't. It is dependent very much sometimes on where you're from, where you go to school, and a whole load of other socioeconomic factors. It's been in our own alternative budget that we'd like to see scrapping of the student contribution fee. I think it's interesting when we hear government saying things like, we've got this much of a surplus, we've got Apple tax this, and I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to pretend to understand all of these things. We've got National Training Fund money, 2 billion. The question really, I think, should be not to people who are in opposition or otherwise. The question should be to government, how can you possibly stand over saying that we're in such a good state, such good financial state? You've really stuck it to the man over the last couple of years. We've been the best boys in class. We've really sorted ourselves out over the last 10 years. How can you possibly stand over not investing in the sector when you're the one saying you have this much money, we've done this well, we're investing in all this talent, people are coming to us, they're begging to come to Ireland, they want to put all their foreign direct investment here because we just have so much talent. The question should be to the government, how can you possibly stand and look at us with a straight face and not be investing in that sector when you've got all that money there? And that would be the question. If I had a magic wand, I'd invest it tomorrow. I wish I had that. But the question has to be, how are you not investing it if we're in such a good state and you are so committed to our international reputation as being the land of saints and scholars and everyone's coming here because we've got such a talent pool? Well, then how dare you not invest in it?
So, O'Reilly, could we answer that? And isn't there also, just to add, isn't there also an argument to be made that those people who can afford the student contribution, they should pay more for it? Not less, not abolish it completely. People, I dare say it, like some people in this room who can easily afford to pay more than €3,000 for their children to go to university. Go on.
I think that there's pretty much a consensus here, and I presume through the room, that the entire issue pivots around access, ensuring that every youngster or young person can access college and can access third-level education, and indeed can access later lifelong learning. So it's access. Last year, as a government, we took a net 1,500 of the fees for anyone earning less than 100,000, which is the great mass of people. I think, truthfully and honestly, we've done enough in that. I mean, I might tinker with it. If it was my call, I'd tinker with it maybe a little more, but the real issue is access, and around access, the real issue is the SUSI grants. Now, what I do think was transformative last year was that we shifted back the postgrads, because virtually most people aspire to a postgrad now and want to do one, and that's the prerogative, and it's great to see it. It's a wonderful transformation from the Ireland that I grew up in, and I'm thrilled about it. But we now moved the SUSI grant to be available to those again. We did increase the SUSI grant last year, but I think we should put our eggs in that basket this time. We should increase the maintenance element of the SUSI grants. And we should, as Malcolm says, lift the ceiling to access it, because it is now where in most homes now, you have two parents working. And I find from my clinic work or my constituency work that no matter how bad, even on the minimum wage, with two parents working, they're very close to coming out of the range for the SUSI grant. So we do need to lift that, and we do need to increase the amounts. So to answer your question succinctly, I would park the reduction of the fees. I might go another few hundred on it, but effectively park it, and I would shift to the SUSI grants. And I would shift very much. I find it so depressing, to go back to something I said earlier, to see people get on a bus in Virginia and County Cavan to commute to this wonderful college, of which I'm a past student myself, to commute to this college and a myriad of other colleges around the city of Dublin, on a daily basis, spend an hour, 2 hours in peak time in traffic, 2 hours back. And truthfully, we've got to end that. They're not having a proper university experience. Yeah, so what do I say? I say put the money in the SUSI grants, put the money in student accommodation. We've done, with 1,500 last year, we've effectively abolished the fees.
Okay. Pauline O'Reilly, we have a difference here philosophically between the government parties and the opposition parties. Are you going to tell us that the Greens are going into government again between a Fáil and Fine Gael?
Look, I was there for the negotiations to go into government, and we didn't only speak to the two that we eventually ended up with. We spoke to the others as well. And this question,
fees, what's your view on fees?
Well, this question did come up, and I suppose like you've got kind of three issues around funding. You've got the 307, or however much you want to say it is now, with inflation a couple of years on.
It's a lot, like it's 307 annually, as Professor Clough said.
It's a massive amount of
money.
money.
It's a huge amount, yeah.
You've got that. You've also got the fees, and then you've also got the other associated costs with going to university, which is accommodation, transport, and as Joe quite rightly said, like I know people come into Galway who have no accommodation in Galway, and the train's packed up from Limerick, Ennis, on a line that nobody wanted open except for us, but now you see students using that all of the time. Now, if you had an unlimited amount of money, and you might argue the government or whoever, the state does have an unlimited amount of money, you'd throw it into everything. But what I don't think that you should do is to say, my first priority is abolishing fees and not addressing the other two issues, because you're not really addressing the fundamental issue then for education. That's the approach that we took. The approach that we took was, if your number one thing is, and we're not going into government on this, we do this one thing, which is abolishing fees, but you have nothing to stand on in terms of addressing core funding, and you have nothing to stand on in terms of addressing the accommodation and all of that. Now, look, it's not our ministry, and I'm not trying to say hands-off approach. I think that everybody, and look, not everybody agrees with it being a separate ministry, for one thing. I do take an approach that education is lifelong. I think like we have a shocking record in this country in terms of digital skills, particularly for older people. So there's a lot more to education and to funding that is chronically underfunded, in my view, for that lifelong piece. So I think absolutely, if you have an unlimited, abolish everything, pay for everything, everything's free. But you're going to have to rack up taxes if that's what you want to do. You probably are. Like, that's the reality. And like, I can name, and all of us here can name every single organisation that we go to that says, can you make everything free?
Yeah.
And it's not feasible. But so I would say address the other two, including the SUSI grant piece, and particularly around associated costs with going to college. And yes, you should get to having free education again, but we're not there yet.
Okay, we have your view. We have about 25 minutes to go, 25. I'm anxious to get views from the audience, and particularly from the student voice. So do we have any students who want to make a contribution first? And if you're not, I'll move quickly along. Okay, yeah, here. And questions, not speeches, okay?
Yeah. So we heard from the Green Party about you talking about a student saying they were expecting to go on to a master's and a PhD. I'd like to just say this experience, that person's very lucky, very fortunate that there's many people out there in their final year of their undergrad that can't say that they're expecting to go further into their education. With rising postgrad fees for the masters every year, even with SUSI, if you get the highest bracket of support, it only covers a very, very small amount of this fees. And then if you wanted to go on to PhD, we talked a lot about research and the impact this has on our society. A lot of them are actually living below the poverty line, and they're not being recognised for the work they're doing that you guys have talked about being invaluable. So I just want to know from each of the spokespeople, what reason would you give these students to vote for your party? Do you see these students and what commitments would you make?
Okay,
to them?
we'll actually take that, and then I'll take another few round together. But we'll take that, Mairead.
Okay, so for me,
quickly, because obviously time is pushing on. Thanks.
I remembered now what I was going to finish saying the last time. So for me, obviously, when we're saying we're going to get, so for students, right, we're saying we would get rid of the student contribution charge. Do I think it's the biggest cost at this moment in time for students? No, the biggest cost for students at the moment, if they are lucky enough to find accommodation, is student accommodation. That's why we need to see actual investment. That's why we said we'd invest 100 million in terms of student accommodation, and it needs to make sure that it's at that affordable nature. We need to look at SUSI, I think, in its entirety. Yeah, we need to look at increasing SUSI, but we also need to look at SUSI in its entirety. We have far too many students who are coming to us saying, you know, in terms of saying that they're independent. That's a massive issue, and trying to jump through hoops to prove their independence. I also think we need to look at the employment control framework. We've heard earlier about the student staff ratios and the fact that we're falling behind, and the impact that has, obviously, in terms of student experience, but also in terms of our rankings within universities. The other thing is, I brought forward DIGS regulation, and thanks to the Student Union for working with me on that. Thankfully, it was supported by government, and it has gone on to the next stage. That's something that I would implement in government.
Okay, Richard.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, listen, I couldn't agree more, and the point you're making, and that's why we're for scrapping all postgrad fees, not just undergrad fees. And indeed, one of the groups that I campaigned for, who brought this to my attention, were people who were doing doctorates in psychology. And they made the simple point to me. A constituent said, if you're working class, you can't get a PhD in psychology because you're paying. It's not counselling at the time. Counselling and education psychology wasn't funded. And we started a campaign with the young psychologists, and actually the government were forced into some changes, but there are still many barriers of that type. Fees, the fact that you're a bit older, often when you're doing your PhD, means you may have kids, you've certainly got other financial commitments, and literally, if you don't have other resources to help you through, it becomes nearly impossible to envisage doing a doctorate or getting to those higher levels of education. So we have to scrap all of those fees. And I just want to say that it's not either or. And I want to make that clear in case, because some people are saying it's either or. Either you get rid of fees, or you increase the grants, or you deal with student accommodation. In my view, we have to do all of those things. And I would ask people here who sort of gasp and say, oh no, you couldn't do that. How could we do that? Right, to just reject that notion that it's impossible to increase the level of investment in higher and further education to the levels that exist in most of the rest of Europe. And they do it, and they fund it by not giving huge amounts of money away to tiny groups of corporations.
Okay.
And by the way, I think now our failure to do that, it's not tax policy that is going to scare away inward investment. It is the fact that we're running out of the thing they really came for, which is educated people and indeed the infrastructure associated with it.
Okay, thanks. Annie?
I'm not sure if your question is specifically in relation to postgraduates. I mean, so it's for postgraduates. We had in our alternative budget last year that we want postgraduate workers to be recognised as workers. We've worked very closely with the Postgraduate Workers Organisation on this. We are relentlessly putting in, my team is here, we are relentlessly putting in questions into the various ministries and departments trying to figure out where they're at on that. I mean, postgraduate workers should be recognised as workers. I appreciate that there is concerns in relation to the compacts in various institutions and employment frameworks, that if you recognise PhD workers as workers, then it sends all that topsy-turvy, but I believe if there's a will, there's a way, and we are certainly very committed to recognising those researchers as workers and giving them those workers' rights. We need not even delve into the fact that PhDs are being asked to sign a document which is declaring something that is incorrect to revenue, and I think there is potential for a case to be taken there at some point, and every single institution is guilty of that, and that is going to be a problem, I think, in the next coming years. That is just a big whole thing that's just sitting there that we're expecting PhD researchers to do. And I just very quickly want to say, the issue around fees and not, that's the thing I have around this landscape of what we think our education sector should look like, and what we're saying who should pay and who shouldn't pay. And you had a question about, like, if people can afford to pay more, should they not? Well, then we can have a conversation, because all students most of them are based, their SUSI grants are based on their parents. But then we should maybe have a conversation about the wealth tax and how much tax we're taking in and who's paying that tax, and do we need to have a higher band of tax, and looking at how we're distributing wealth in this country and how that affects our education system.
Okay, thanks, that's very useful. Malcolm?
You asked a very specific question around why should an early stage researcher vote for any of their parties. So why should an early stage researcher vote for Fianna Fáil? I outlined very clearly in terms of the 3 priorities and the choices. The second one that I said very clearly was about investment in research infrastructure and early stage researchers. We have seen increases in terms of early stage researchers' grants. It's not sufficient. I accept it. As Joe mentioned earlier, we have seen postgraduate grants increase. I would point to the fact, and it goes back to Gary's point earlier, Fianna Fáil was the party of PRTLI, which kick-started research in this country, that set up the Irish Research Councils for both the arts and also for science, engineering and technology. In terms of the new agency, THEA, the new National Research Agency, and I want to see, the test is going to be about the delivery on it, but we have got to support and invest in those early stage researchers. So what I would say is, as a political party, I'm the one who's given a very clear and direct answer in terms of what our priorities are. And I would also say, look at the party's record specifically in that area. And I would agree, with Richard in terms of, look, I would love to see, all of this being done in terms of investment in all of those areas. But it is linked, the other side's linked to expenditure policy is tax policy. And it does mean about ensuring that you're pro-business and that we need to provide the research supports for businesses to also take on and engage with early stage researchers. And by the way, not just business, but social enterprises, arts organisations, and so on as well.
Okay, Joe, quickly, and then Pauline, and then I'll take 3 or 4 questions together because time is moving on.
It's just important to revert, and I will be quick, to revert back to the initial premise. I accept, hands up, no question about it, that there has been, for whatever combination of reasons, a fall in proper investment at third level. I think that's required. I think we need to bring your staff, and this is related to the postgraduate question, we need to bring your staff-teacher ratio down to 17. For retention, for keeping people in university, you need a low staff-teacher ratio. And I accept all that. In relation to your specifics of postgrads, as I said to you last year, we brought back the maintenance element. I believe personally that we should this year work on the postgraduate fees and increase the maintenance element. So basically, I think we have the money to do it. We can't be ridiculous and make ludicrous promises and we can't insult your intelligence with patronising nonsense either. The truth is there are limitations to this, but I honestly believe that in the present economic climate that we should increase the decrease postgrad fees incrementally and make a good start this year, and that we should go on increasing the maintenance element for the SUSI. I have no issue with that, and I think, to be truthful, that will happen, and I certainly have no indication that it won't.
Okay, great. Pauline, and then I'm going to move on quickly.
Yeah, just to say, my entire point was that people need to be helped with funding masters and PhDs, because you go back 30, 40 years, there weren't the number of people who had that expectation. But what we can't do is to say, oh great, we've funded now your undergrad, job done. One of the, I suppose, associated with the accommodation, the other point that comes up all of the time is how unaffordable it is to do your postgrads, and that's the entire point that I was making. So we can't just forget about that element, and we're all living longer, and skills have changed, and we need more research in order to have an effective, not just economy, but society where we all feel fulfilled. So, like others, I would absolutely think everything should be funded, but where are the priorities in terms of where you fund things? And it is underfunded.
Well, where are your priorities?
Well, I do think that it's not acceptable to be earning below the minimum wage, which is what people are earning when they're doing postgrads, and you are contributing to a bank of knowledge that is contributing to call them revolutions, call them whatever you want, that the country is currently undergoing. And if we fail to see people stepping up and thinking that they can achieve postgrads, then we are not just failing those people, but we're actually failing the entire country and future generations.
Okay, I'm going to take a few questions. Declan, I know you were first up at the back. Yeah, quickly. And then, yeah. I'm going to take 3 or 4 together, yeah.
Thank you very much. Declan Rafferty, Chief Operations Officer here at DCU. Student accommodation. We're in the thick of it for the last 2 years trying to build on-campus affordable student accommodation. So a few points. Yes, we do rent it out in the summer to anybody we possibly can. Conferences, summer programs, tourists, helps keep the rent down during term time. If you currently build student accommodation on campus with no land costs and you borrow as cheaply as we possibly can to the European Investment Bank, and you just build to regs, there's nothing luxurious about it, they are functional, you cannot build accommodation without renting it at €14,000 or higher. That's the reality, the hyperinflation world we live in, post-COVID, post-Ukraine war, etc. So a simple question for the panel, Gary, keep it simple. What is affordable accommodation? Is that €6,000 a year, academic year? Is that 10,000? Is that 12,000? That dictates the financial model ultimately you have to do. Borrowing a loan will not allow you to build affordable accommodation.
Okay, yeah. With the beer there, yeah.
I don't know if that's working. Sorry, I'll try not to waffle. No, this is just in relation to the abolishment of contribution fees, specifically for those of you who are supporting this. I think we need to be a bit conscious of, I think one of you has mentioned, that a lot of these companies that we're putting funding into are both giving opportunities for employment, but also opportunities through stipends. And I know that some of you has mentioned the IRC and the HRB. These are, although government funded, it's also hugely competitive. Only 17% of postgraduate students make this. Students who are on the Dean's Honour List for both their undergrad and their masters don't make these types of stipends. So I just wanted to mention that first off. So I think my question is, if we're abolishing fees and taking this money away from companies, this 800 million away from the student contribution fee, I'm curious, how are we supporting these PhD students? Because essentially they will be the industry leaders. How are we supporting them through this?
Okay, pass the mic there to the chap two up, yeah.
Thank you, and I just want to thank the organisers for having us here today on the panel. Just a quick one, we've put a lot of focus on access, and rightfully so. But retention, student retention is an issue, and part of that issue is and it has been briefly mentioned here today, is the dire precarious situation that a lot of lecturers and academics find themselves in, where they're only paid a couple of hours per week, less than minimum wage perhaps, when you work it out, so they're only employed for their contact time. This has to be addressed. The pastoral care needs of the students, the staff-student ratios, the teacher-student ratios that we mentioned are deteriorating. What specifically are the panel going to do about that should it be successful?
Okay, we'll take 2 more here, one right here. And at the front, yeah.
Hi, Natasha Weir-Brown. Just before I retired, I was for 6 years member of the Administrative Council of a group of Masters Science and Technological Universities in France. There's been a lot of talk about Europe here and how, kind of we're falling behind, and that's certainly true from what I can see. But we haven't talked at all about the income we can get from Europe. So, for example, I'm particularly thinking, I hope there's a liaison group in the HE to talk about all those Irish institutions that are part of the European universities groupings. Also, we've also been talking a lot about sources of income and lifelong learning. Lifelong learning is going to be very much part of our future. Students at universities are not going to be the usual university students that we think of now. And we can get some of our money back from Apple and from training their people who are no longer fit for purpose because AI has taken a lot of their jobs away.
Thank you. And at the front? Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Paul Allen from the British Irish Chamber of Commerce. What do the panel think of introducing a 2.5% ring fence on all corporate tax revenue? That would close the gap in terms of the funding gap straight away. It would also close the research funding gap. And then I suppose 2 quick follow-ons. Is it appropriate that the Irish Taxpayer Fund what becomes Australian doctors without any clawback? And then the third one is just a point actually, is when we talk about The third point is just in relation to not forgetting the squeezed middle when we talk about the 2,000 registration fee. And if you are a high income earning household, I think it's fair to say you should get something back for your taxes.
Okay, I'll take one last question from this chap here, and then we'll wrap it up then. We'll try and answer some of those questions. I'll go to Declan's one specifically first. Some of the things have been repeated already in the discussion. So yeah, quickly.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I fully get the fixation with bricks and mortar, who doesn't like cutting a ribbon, right? But in terms of the student experience, and speaking as a representative of the Human Capital Initiative, the student experience, we hear from our students, they want to look at real world problems, they want to work with industry leaders. So facilitating industry leaders getting involved in the co-design and co-delivery of our programs, if they can access the training fund in order to do that, that will make them easier for us to recruit them on an organised basis rather than just guest lectures here and there.
Indeed, we can't answer all these questions because we have, I'm being like guillotined here pretty quickly. But on Declan's question about building cost, Richard, and then Mairead. Richard, on building cost.
Yeah, well, to be honest, you were making the point I was making earlier on. That's why I expressed concern about relying on finance and borrowing. We have to recognise student accommodation has to be subsidised. Right, the state has to recognise that to bring it to affordable levels. And to my mind, what is affordable is 15, 20, 25% max of somebody's income. That's what's affordable. And you've got to essentially set rents at that. And that is very significantly below what they are currently being set at by, the cost of finance. So that is my answer to that.
Okay, Malcolm, on precarious employment, that's a big issue in universities, and it goes to the heart of the student experience in terms of permanent contracts and people who we hire and then we have to leave go pretty quickly. What's your view on that?
Yeah, well, nobody should be. I mean, the laws with regard to labour laws should be applied universally, and nobody should be in a precarious situation. So somebody who is employed within an institution should be employed on proper contracts. That's that's plain simple. I know that is not the case. I don't sit on the education committee, but I know it has come up before the education committee. But I certainly share the view nobody should be employed in a difficult situation like that. I want to touch, if I can, Gary, on just one or two of the issues.
Very quickly, one issue
that were raised.
We have about 3 minutes. I have one question I want to ask.
Well, can I just to touch on both the student retention issue and something I think is
I wanted to ask that
on
so quickly.
On student retention, and then also Natasha's point about Europe. I think student retention is critical because there's very little point in terms of us giving somebody an opportunity to go into higher education and then they leave. Now, they may find that they go on to a different course, but if they're completely lost to the system through non-progression, that is a problem. I think we do need to look at the question around guidance counselling in second levels, because a lot of students end up in programmes that they don't fully appreciate what is actually involved. I actually believe, and there's evidence to suggest it, and why one of the highest non-progression rates is in computing-related subjects is because students don't realise the maths element, and it's not brought forward to them at second level. I'd entirely agree with Natasha's point around Europe, and we don't tap into a lot of the European funding sufficiently. There is also a crucial difference when we compare ourselves to other European systems, is we've also got to remember we have a far higher participation rate among the 18 to 20 age cohort. I mean, we've one of the highest participation rates in higher education in the world. I think it's at something like 62% now of the 18 to 20 year old age cohort. There's a debate about whether that should be the case because our participation rates in further education are lower. And I think even when we're talking about the NTF and everything else, we shouldn't divorce it from the debate around further education. Paul's point finally around a ring fence, given that there's some employers who already commit about.
I gave you enough speak. Yeah. Mairead, that point about the squeeze middle and the point about giving back. Well,
which point?
These points here at the front.
There are so many different points.
There's so many.
That's a very generic thing.
Yeah,
Well, I actually took down all the notes in case there was a bit of confusion. But I suppose in relation to, I'm not really sure which parts you mean, but
answer what you want.
Okay, here, whatever. Okay, see, in terms of the student affordable housing, right? Declan's point, 100%. So the 100 million that we would have invested last year in last year's budget is a different type, would deliver something different this year. That's the reality of the situation. For me, there there isn't a clear definition of what affordable student accommodation is. That has to be led from the minister's table, in my view. What we need to see is a round table of everyone coming together and figuring out exactly how it's done. I don't see the point in me saying, oh, you know, 2,000 a year. You know what I mean? But I do know that 14,000 a year isn't affordable. In relation to the 2.5% on all tax, I think if I decided what our financial, I think Pierce Doherty would bring me into a room and say, "What in the name of God are you doing?" But
is it a good idea, though? But like, and I'm going to finish up by asking everyone quickly: is it a good idea to ring fence funding?
I think we need multi-annual funding, right? I said that at the start of my opening contribution. I've also outlined exactly where we would put funding. I think in relation to, is it appropriate to stop, you know, people heading off to Australia when they're when they finish becoming doctors? I think we need to. I think we need to be building the kind of society that young people can and want to stay in. You know, we have such potential in this country, and the fact that so many of our young people are emigrating, you know, heading off. We've seen such an increase in terms of the amount of young people are emigrating that it's back to the 2013 level. Again, I just want to say in terms of the employment control framework, we believe that needs, like, that's a hangover from austerity. We believe that needs to be gotten rid of, and that's part of that really does hinder recruitment processes for third level education, and also that is part of the precarious nature. But we do need to look at the precarious nature in its totality as well. And
Okay, great. Others. Joe, ring fence funding quickly. Yes or no?
Obviously, we have it with the NTF.
Yes.
And it's a failure, truthfully, in the sense that it's locked there. And the Taoiseach is, and it will happen, is committed to unlocking that. And that must happen. So if we're going to lock it, it's of no value if it can't be accessed, and it's not been accessed currently. Now, in relation to the staff ratio, I believe we should go to 17, but I believe that the 307 figure, which is agreed by the university sector as much as by government, that will deal with that question. In relation to postgraduate stipends, I have a little practical knowledge of this. I have 3 sons who have gone through virtually every one of these processes. And I do know for my eldest son that the stipends are very, very low and not viable.
They're hopeless.
Yeah, hopeless.
They're hopeless. You can't live on them, for God's sake.
I know from we actually supplemented him while he was on the stipend.
Welcome to my world, exactly.
We had to double it, literally.
Yeah. Okay, I've been warned here at the start that if I keep talking, this will be, and I know Richard's rushing off to the finance committee, is very important. So indeed. Well, we won't. If I started on state wasting of money, we'd be here for another hour. It's just beholden on me to say a few words of thanks. I want to thank Leo Sullivan in particular from the IUA for tremendous organisational skills in putting this together on behalf of the IUA and all the other groups here, BICC, the IUA, the RIA, THEA, and most importantly, I think, the Union of Students in Ireland. I'd like to thank Professor Keogh of the university for hosting us here today, and particularly I'd like to thank my panel, Pauline, Joe, Malcolm, Annie, Richard, and Mairead for putting up with my infelicities and trying to cheer this debate. And I think we really got a lot out of it. And I mean, in one way, it's disheartening to hear Pauline say that higher education doesn't come up in the doors. I think we're all long enough in the tooth to know that there's nothing unusual in that. But I think it is important. No, I know, but it is important. No, I agree completely. But it is important that higher education is central to the political debate. And on that note, thanks a lot.